All right, we have made our way out of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and we are ready to head into the conquest of Canaan, and for the next several books, we'll be talking about what happens when the Israelites, the Hebrews, finally get to the Promised Land. If the book of Joshua were a movie, you would definitely see it filed on Netflix in the action section in the J's between Jaws and Jurassic Park, because it's got a lot of action in it. It's a story of military conquest, intrigue, espionage. It has bravery, dedication, deceit, trickery. It just covers just about every spectrum. Spiritually, Joshua is full of instructions, as we're going to see, and I'm going to focus mostly on that. Full of instructions for Christians. He's going to lead the people Moses leads the people to the border of the Promised Land, but you remember he's unable to lead them over, and so General Joshua takes over, and he's going to offer spiritual instructions to the people that are just as applicable to us today as they were to them. They really are, and I think you will see that. Organizationally, Joshua is an absolute model for effective leadership. The book is laced with leadership principles. It's actually been used as a study book for leaders. Militarily, the book is literally a blueprint for military campaigns and battle strategies. Joshua employed a divide and conquer strategy and approach that has been mimicked by many. So, after approximately 400 years in Egypt, in slavery, and another 40 years of wilderness wanderings, the Israelites are finally on the border of the land God promised them. Joshua leads the Hebrews on a mission to conquer the land and repel the heathen people who are living there and reclaim it as his initial promise, a nation devoted to God. And the book is very easily divided. And we're going to spend nearly all of our time in the first two sections here. Only two stories I'm going to take from the last section. So really easily to divide. The first 5 chapters on conquering the Promised Land, entering the Promised Land, miraculously I might add. The next 7 chapters on conquering the Promised Land, some of the battles, and then the last 12 chapters on occupying, splitting out, dividing the Promised Land and possessing it. We'll spend far less time there than anywhere else. The first 9 verses of chapter 1 could literally be subtitled, "The Making of a Leader." They introduce us to Israel's new chief and his qualifications for leadership, and the Lord reassures Joshua with words any of us in his shoes would have been happy to hear. "Be strong and courageous," God tells Joshua, "for you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I would give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions God gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you will be successful in everything you do. Study this book of instruction continually. Meditate on it day and night, so you will be sure to obey everything written in it. Only then will you prosper and succeed in all you do." So here you go. The Lord is reassuring Joshua that he's going to be with him, and he's giving him the same kinds of words of advice that we need to get from the Lord, and that is be strong and courageous. No, wait a minute. Be strong and very courageous, he says to him. And Joshua wastes no time whatsoever. He, in turn, turns to the people and charges the officers and the people with the task God has given them. Go through the camp and tell the people to get their provisions ready. In 3 days you will cross the Jordan River and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you. And this time you'll see that the people are going to answer positively. They're ready to accept the command. In contrast to 40 years earlier, 40 years earlier, remember, the people refused to respond this way. So they said to Joshua, we'll do whatever you command us. We'll go wherever you send us. We will obey you just as we obeyed Moses. And may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against your orders and does not obey your words and everything you command will be put to death. And notice this, the people also respond with those same words. You're going to see them, be strong and courageous, over and over again. Be strong and courageous. And so, here we go. They are on the opposite side of the Jordan River, ready to go across into Canaan. They are in the exact same spot they were 40 years earlier. Exact same spot where they turned back. You remember in our study of Numbers 3 weeks ago how there's this very same spot at Kadesh Barnea, and Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan, right? And 10 of the 12 spies come back and say, we can't do it. The people are giants. There's too many of them. They're too big as they are. It is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey, but we can't do it. And they believed the majority of negative people rather than the minority that had God with it. And God sent them wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and no one over the age of 20, except for Caleb and Joshua, lived for this moment. They waited until every person over the age of 20, 100 people a day, died. 100 people a day. Now here they are, right back where they were. And oh no, the same thing's going to happen. They're going to send spies over into the promised land. Joshua secretly sent out 2 spies from the Israelite camp at Acacia Grove. He instructed them, scout out the land on the other side of the Jordan River, especially around Jericho. So the 2 men set out and came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there that night. But someone told the king of Jericho, some Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. Here we go again. But this time, notice Joshua only sends 2 instead of 12. Carefully picked. I'm sure he already knew they were going to be optimistic. In fact, Jewish legends suggest they were Caleb for his second trip as a spy into the promised land, and the high priest, Eleazar. Joshua tells these men to focus their attention just on Jericho, because Jericho is going to be the first and biggest city they are going to attack in quite a while. Jericho was one of many Canaan's city-states. It was a city, but it was a state in and of itself as well, as Canaan was divided among many, many pagan peoples. So there's some things you have to understand about Jericho. This is sort of a modern rendering of it. Jericho was a fortified city. It was 7 miles west of the Jordan River. So if they're on the other side of the Jordan River right now. If they get across the Jordan River, then they got another 7 miles to go to get to the promised land, to get to Jericho. And the whole city consisted of 7 acres surrounded by a double wall. So 7 acres is not a whole lot, you know. This church campus, as it sits right now, is sitting on 13 acres. So, imagine that. The entire city of Jericho, little half than our entire church campus, surrounded by this double wall. The outer wall was, this outer wall was 6 feet thick. The inner wall was wider, 12 feet. The first wall was 11 feet high. The second wall was 35 feet high. and the wall was tilted at a 35-degree angle, and the tilt, obviously, prevented anyone from being able to scale it if they were trying to invade the land. Jericho's walls were going to be Israel's first real military challenge, and no small one at that. Now, you'll notice the spies went to a house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there that night. And some people have expressed some embarrassment over the years that the spies hid out in a prostitute's house. But think about that for a minute. A prostitute was accustomed to housing strangers, particularly people from out of town. The spies could remain at her house and hope to maintain their anonymity. Couldn't do that anywhere else. It was probably about the only place that was a possibility. Nevertheless, as the text says, someone saw the Israeli spies and ratted on Rahab and reported the spies to the king. So a very tense moment occurred when the Jericho detectives knocked on the door to interrogate Rahab. One sneeze, and it would all be over. But Rahab had hidden the two men, and she said to the authorities, the men were here earlier, but I didn't know where they were from. They left the town at dusk as the gates were about to close, and I don't know where they went. If you hurry, you can probably catch up with them. You might say she sent them on a wild goose chase. I don't care whether you like it or not, it's funny. Because that's exactly what she did. And she told them two specific lies. They weren't here, and I don't know where they've gone. I just don't know. But if you hurry, you can catch them. Which brings up a provocative question that, Lord knows, I would love to stand here and discuss all day. And that is, are we ever justified in telling a lie? Are we ever justified in telling a lie? Now, I've taken both sides of this debate. In theology class, I've taken both sides of this. It's called situational ethics. And I have argued that you're never justified to text, and I've argued that you are, and I love the argument of it. I love the whole discussion of it. But I don't have time. I can't take the last 40 minutes just to talk about that. So I'm going to give you my opinion in one word, and I said it's my opinion. Yes. I think when Nazi stormtroopers rounded up Jews to send them to the death camps, and everybody knew that was what was happening, it was not only excusable but noble to lie and save their lives. I think, generally speaking, this: when telling a lie can avoid a greater and a more grievous sin than the lie itself, as in this case, as in the case with the Nazis, as in some cases that are going on right now in the Ukraine, then I think God looks at the heart. I don't fully advocate situational ethics, but I do believe in spirit-led ethics. I do believe what the New Testament says in 2 Corinthians 3:6, the letter of the law kills, but the Spirit gives life. And I also think that a strict legalistic application of the law will never take into account many of life's ironies, and that's why God has given us His indwelling Holy Spirit to guide us and to apply morals and ethics in a loving and consistent way in an environment where it is necessary. I wish we had a lot more time. I'd love to do the whole talk about situational ethics and talk about that and talk about how some people will justify lying when it's not justified and talk about the times when it is and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, that's what she did, and God honored it. And Rahab tells the spies, she and the people of Jericho have heard of what God did in Egypt and east of the Jordan. And they realize that God is the true God, and she knows Jericho's going to fall, and she knows the Hebrews are going to triumph. So she is trying to position herself on the winning team. Hey, God's side ultimately is always the winning team. And that's where she's trying to get to. So verse 14, the two spies say to her, "We offer our own lives as a guarantee for your safety. If you don't betray us, we will keep our promise and be kind to you when the Lord gives us the land. When we come into the land, when we invade, you must leave this scarlet rope hanging from the window through which you let us down." So, a prostitute is promised a place in God's family. She had fallen off the ladder of morality a long time ago. And it had nothing to do with Rahab's lily white goodness, because she didn't have any, or perfect purity that saved her. It was her faith in the one true God that she talked about. And amazingly, both in the Hall of Fame of Faith in Hebrews 11:31 and in the book of James in chapter 2 and verse 25, the faith of Rahab is discussed. And if you really want to know the extent to which this decision she made was honored by God, all you got to do is go to the first verses of the first book in the New Testament and the lineage of Jesus Christ. And right there in the lineage of Jesus Christ, you will see next to the pedigree of the purest of faith, Rahab the prostitute. Amazing. It's amazing. So, back to the story. Two spies rappel down the wall, back to that action movie we were talking about in the beginning, on a rope lowered from Rahab's window, and they hide for 3 days in the mountain, and then they return to the camp. And when they get there, totally different report from the first spy report. "We can do it. We should do it. Let's go." I'm paraphrasing that, but that's really kind of what they said. For 3 days now, the nation camped by the river. They watched the raging water swollen by the spring rains. And then chapter 3 recounts, interestingly, the day for which the Hebrews had waited 440 years. Joshua mobilizes the people to cross the Jordan River. Now, I'm sure they pondered how approximately, we think, 3 million Hebrew men, women, and children were going to get across the Jordan River. It's interesting, Joshua didn't send out his Army Corps of Engineers here. Mechanics of the crossing were going to be God's problem. You know what he sent out? You remember the story? If not, it's in there. You know what he sent out? He told the priest to get the Ark of the Covenant and for the priest to start walking into the water with the Ark of the Covenant in front of them. Now remember, whose presence was in the Ark of the Covenant as it stayed in the tabernacle? God's himself. So what's God saying? I am going to walk straight in that water. You, by faith, are going to walk behind me. The water is Israel's problem. God is willing to work through the problem. Joshua's job is to connect God to his problem. So they did. They arrived at the banks of the Jordan River where they camped before crossing. 3 days later, the Israelite officers went through the camp giving these instructions to the people. When you see the Levitical priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, move out from your positions and follow them. And they did. And get this. The same miracle that God had used to deliver Israel from Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, he uses again. This time to cross the Jordan River and to bring them into the promised land. The same miracle. But in the beginning, the miracle doesn't occur until the priests carrying the ark step into the water first. In other words, the miracle was preceded by steps of faith. Maybe We have missed some of God's miracles for us because we have not stepped first in faith. When they got to the other side, God and Joshua never wanted Israel to forget this moment, this miracle. So they said, we will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, they got a stone for each of the tribes. In the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones mean? And you can tell them, they reminded us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Covenant went across, and these stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever. It's good to have memorials. We'll have one this morning about the cross during communion. It's great to have memorials. When we decided to build this building back in 2006, I did two things. First thing I did, and some of you who were here then, and I'll ask you for a show of hands if you were here then, we had, I think, in my opinion, in the 39 years I've been here, the most moving service that we ever had, I've ever been in here. We called it the Stones of Remembrance service. We announced we were going to build this building, and I had stones all across the front on the floor. And depending on what your relationship was with the church, you came up and got stones. So I said, everybody who was raised in this church as a child, come get a stone. And so any of the children or teenagers or even adults that were in the church came and got a stone. And I said, anybody who was baptized in this church, came to Christ in this church, come get a stone. And so several more did. I said, anybody who was married in this church. So one stone, each of them had the stone had a picture of baptism on it, and the other one had a picture of a child on it. And then anybody who was married in the church had pictures of wedding rings on it. Anybody who was married in this church, come get this. And then we had a stone called faith. I meant to bring it. It's on my desk right over there, and I meant to bring it in. And we had a stone called faith that everybody in the church got. So everybody left with at least one stone. Some people left with all four. How many of you were here and remember that day? Raise your hand. Well, you were here. Boy, there aren't many of us left. It was quite a thing. And we did it for this same reason. And then, 2 or 3 weeks before we moved into this building, actually, we came over here. After assembling on McGregor Boulevard, we came over here and we let anybody write on the floors, before the floors were finished, anything they wanted to write. So my favorite verses and then a special personal message from me are written right here where I stand every week. And anybody could write in different places and all over the place. My wife's is in her classroom where she wrote, and on and on. And it was, why do we do those kinds of things? Because it is important to remember. And that's what they were doing here. And when God dammed up the Jordan for his people to cross it, it scared the living daylights out of the Canaanite kings. This was not going to be a fair fight. Their gods couldn't do that. The Hebrews were getting some kind of supernatural help of some kind. And so as we move into chapter 5, it's interesting, in 1887, an archaeological discovery confirmed what we have just looked at here in Joshua 5:1, and that is that they were ready to go into the promised land. And this was just 100 and something years ago. This archaeological discovery called the Amarna letters were found. You know what they were? They were a coalition of Canaanite kings to the Pharaoh in Egypt requesting military assistance to stave off a powerful group of invaders. And they refer to the invaders as the Habirus, Habirus, which is, guess who? The Hebrews. And no help was sent. Obviously, the Egyptian pharaohs had enough of these people. They were fine to let them continue to stay gone. But good archaeological evidence of what happened during the time. And so when the Israelites were camped right on the plains of Jericho, they celebrated Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the first month, and the very next day they began to eat unleavened bread and roasted. You remember, it's supposed to be the land of milk and honey, the land of plenty. They ate manna, they ate quail, and then suddenly, whoof, the door had opened, and they began to eat unleavened bread and roasted grain harvested from the land. And the minute they crossed over the Jordan River, the manna ceased. The quail ceased. The miracle rations came to an end. It was time for Israel to rise up in faith and possess all that God has promised. And indeed it did. The end of chapter 5 marks a turning point for Joshua. Now, if I were to ask you, who led the Israelites in the Battle of Jericho, who would you say? Go ahead. Who would you say? Who? You did say the Lord, right? Good. Yeah, you'd be right. And some of the other people that said Joshua would be wrong. Because here's what happened. You remember the old spiritual, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, 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 Jericho. And you say Joshua, and you'd be mistaken. General Joshua was out on his own reconnaissance mission by himself near the town of Jericho, looking up, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a sword in the hand. And Joshua went up to him and said, "Are you friend or foe?" And he said, "Neither one." I love that answer. I mean, Joshua's trying to decide. He's out on his own reconnaissance mission. Undoubtedly, he's looking up at these walls. He's knowing they're double walls. He's thinking, how are we ever going to conquer these walls? And suddenly somebody appears in front of him, and you would think that it might be a foe, might be a citizen of Jericho who's out on guard. So are you friend or foe? Neither one. I am the commander of the Lord's army. Joshua fell with his face to the ground in reverence and said, "I am at your command. What do you want your servant to do?" And the commander of the Lord's army said, "The same thing that he did out of the burning bush to Moses 440 years earlier. Take off your sandals. The place in which you're standing is holy ground." Joshua knew that story from Moses. He had probably heard that story hundreds of times from Moses. And Joshua did as he was told. And so he asked, "Are you friend or foe?" And the commander answers, in effect, "Well, it really depends on your answer. The question is not, am I on your side, but are you on God's side?" See, so often we hope God is on our side. But the real question should always be, am I on God's side? Because God calls the shots, not me, not you. God is the commander-in-chief of the Lord's army, not me, not you. Joshua is being told here, and thankfully he understands the message, move aside, heaven has come to help. Joshua is being replaced by the commander of the Lord's army himself, leading the Hebrews into battle. And so verse 15 records Joshua steps aside and respects a higher command. What a comfort this must have been to Joshua on the night before the attack. The commander of the Lord's armies comes to take responsibility for the campaign. Now, who is this guy, this commander of the Lord's army? Oh, it's pretty obvious, very obvious to me. The clue is in how Joshua treats him. He takes off his shoes, he falls on the ground in front of him and worships him. That precludes him being an angel. We do know angels sometimes came and told people, there was an angel that came and talked to Mary, right? The mother of Jesus. So we do know angels sometimes delivered message, but angels are never worshiped. Only God is supposed to be worshiped. So it's almost certain this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, just as it was in the lion's den, just as it was in the fiery furnace. There was a fourth person standing there. There are at least 3, 4, maybe even 5 instances of pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus in the Old Testament. So the commander in chapter 6 of the Lord's armies gives, I'm not going to take the time to go read all of that, the commander gives Joshua a strange battle plan. Maybe the strangest ever given. I mean, there's some ingenious generals that have used some unorthodox combat strategies since then, but none have ever been as bizarre as this plan of battle. This is not your typical West Point Army plan or your Pentagon strategy. Can you imagine Joshua sitting down with his generals that night and saying, all right, I'm going to give you the plan for our attack on Jericho. What's the plan, boss? We're going to march around Jericho once a day for 6 days. Then we're going to march around 7 times on the 7th day. And then on the 7th day, we're going to blow some trumpets really loud and shout. And then the walls are just going to fall right down in front of us. Really? Has the boss hit the sauce? Is what they probably were thinking. And yet, that's exactly what happened. And they killed the inhabitants of Jericho except for their promise. Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute and her relatives who were with her in the house because she had hidden the spies Joshua sent to Jericho. And then this is an important item. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. So in other words, they didn't just spare and then leave her on her own. She became a part of them. In fact, she not only became a part of them, but she ended up marrying a Hebrew named Salmon. They had a son named Boaz, who married Ruth, who had a son named Obed, who had a son named Jesse. Remember Jesse? He had a son named David, who fathered Israel's greatest dynasty and eventually gave rise to not just an earthly king, but an eternal king named Jesus. And so Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, didn't just live among the Israelites to this day. She wound up in the lineage of Jesus and in what we know in Hebrews 11 as the Hall of Fame of faith. So here's an interesting story. After Jericho, Joshua set his sight on further conquest, but remember, he's a brilliant strategist. So Gilgal is going to be his beachhead and base, and from Gilgal he sends troops into battle in what is known as a divide and conquer strategy. Just west of Jericho, just up the road, is a tiny town, no walls, no fortress. After topping the formidable city of Jericho, Ai would be very, very easy pickings. What Joshua didn't know is the battle had already been lost. Israel violated the instructions about the things set apart for the Lord. A man named Achan had stolen some of the dedicated things, and the Lord was very angry with the Israelites. It's kind of like when a coach has a team, if you got a football team, and one lineman reacts early and jumps early, the whole line runs. The whole line runs because the whole team is penalized. The one lineman's not the only one that goes back 5 yards, you know. One lineman holds somebody, well, the whole team goes back 10 yards, not just one going back 10 yards. The whole camp was held responsible for the sin. The seeds of defeat had already been sown at Jericho. I find this so fascinating a story because success is immediately followed by an embarrassing, humiliating defeat. I think I've said this to you before. The time I have to watch for Satan's attack the most in my life is when things are going great. After some spiritual success or some spiritual victory, when things are going great. I'm pretty good in a crisis. I was pretty good in the hurricane. I'm pretty good in a crisis. But after a victory, I have to be just as careful as these people were at Ai. Sometimes you learn more from defeat than you do from victory. And what they learned here was that a man named Achan had stolen items that were supposed to be dedicated to the Lord. And even though Ai was a very small village and should have been easily conquered, they're defeated and 36 Hebrews are killed. And they are turned back. They had just beaten, if you want to put it in sports terms, the number one team in Canaan, Jericho. And they had just now lost to the last place team in all of Canaan, Ai. Wow. Which again goes to show you what really matters is obeying God, not your own ability. And so Joshua is just grieved. He cried out, Lord, why did you bring us across the Jordan River if you were going to let the Amorites kill us? If we had only been content to stay on the other side, Lord, what can I say now that Israel has fled from its enemies? And when the Canaanites and all the other people living in the land hear about it, they will surround us and wipe our name off the face of the earth. And then what will happen to the honor of your great name? God says, look, Joshua, Israel sinned and broke my commandment. And they not only stole, but they lied about it and hid the things among their own belongings. The one who was stolen was set apart from destruction and will be burned with fire along with everything he has. For he has broken the covenant of the Lord and done a horrible thing in Israel and to Israel. Eventually, Achan cops to the sin, and he pays for it with his life. In chapter 10, armies from 5 coalition Canaanite cities prepare to attack Gibeon because it's an important city that has aligned itself with the Israelites. And Joshua stages an all-night attack, catching the armies by surprise. And Joshua prays for God to stop the sun and the moon to give time for his people to fight the battle. He said in that prayer, let the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stayed in place until the nation of Israel had defeated its enemies. Now the reason I bring this up, because I have to pick what I'm going to talk about and what I'm not. And the reason I bring this up is this is one of the skeptics' favorite passages to talk about. They love to scoff at this biblical account and say, did the world really stop rotating? How about tides and floods? It doesn't make sense. The effects of such a thing would be absolutely catastrophic. And of course, sometimes believers come back with, I think, is an argument, but not the best one, and say, well, any God that create the heavenly bodies of the universe could certainly put them in pause mode for a while. I'm not saying he couldn't. I'm just saying it's not the best argument. Others argue the reference is figurative, that the day seemed longer because the Israelites accomplished so much, or that the sun remained cool and the sky overcast so the Israelites wouldn't be affected by the heat of the day. There are several other theories that abound, such as that the time period in between might not have been as long as is suggested. The truth is, we don't know exactly how it happened, how it was caused. We do know this. We do know even Joshua suspected future readers might have a difficult time believing this miracle, so he quoted extra biblical sources. He said, is this event not recorded in the book of Jasher? A historical book has nothing to do with the Bible. Not only that, but in every culture on the planet, there are historical references to a long day or a long day night. The Chinese speak of a long day. The Aztecs of Mexico and the Choctaw Indians and the Peruvian Indians all report about a long night. A fact of history from the most reliable history sources we have, the people who were living at the time, not the people 2,500 years later who are trying to guess at it. How it happened is a mystery. God could have reached out with his hand and slowed the earth's rotation. He created it. He could have done that. Genesis 1:1 says God created the heavens and the earth, and if he created it, he can choose to do with it however he creates. There are some specific scientific explanations, very specific, such as a book written by a colleague of Albert Einstein. The man's name was Immanuel Velikovsky, and he wrote a book called Worlds in Collision. In his book, Velikovsky suggests a comet passed through the Earth's atmosphere in the middle of Joshua's battle, and the comet tilted the Earth's axis, accounting for the long day. So God may have worked directly by using his own hand to produce the phenomenon of the comet. He may have produced some sort of celestial mechanics, perhaps a planetary flyby, or maybe a comet sweeping through the Earth's atmosphere. I do know Velikovsky, very smart man, once debated Carl Sagan, and in my opinion, tore Carl Sagan to pieces. Sagan got to where he wouldn't even answer him in questions in the debate. So I don't know how this happened. None of us do. Imagine God grabbing an aimless comet out of deep space, then just directing its trajectory to reach Earth at the exact moment to coincide with Joshua's prayer. Maybe that's how it happened. We don't know. We know it happened, and they won the battle because of it. Beginning in chapter 13, Joshua leaves behind his thrilling battles and his daring maneuvers and his colossal triumphs and his day the sun stood still, and embroils himself in a very mundane work. As I told you in the beginning, chapters 13 through 24, he starts to divide the land out among the people. And unless you're a property assessor or a tax assessor, you probably don't care too much about this. Quite frankly, the next 12 chapters are a pretty boring account of land allotment, except for two things. In chapter 14, a wonderful, wonderful thing happens. Of the 3 million Hebrews who crossed the Jordan, you remember Joshua and Caleb were the only members of the Exodus generation who were allowed to enter the promised land, the only people over the age of 20. They were among the 10 men who had been sent to spy out the land, and they were the only 2 that said, we can overtake it. And so now Caleb is in his land. He's there. He says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well, as he promised for these 45 years since Moses made this promise. He's 85. He's 85. Even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I'm 85 years old, and I'm as strong as I was when Moses sent me on that first journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me, in the King James, the old King James, it said, give me that mountain. Give me that mountain, or give me that hill country that the Lord promised me. And you remember that, he says, you'll remember that as scouts, we found in those mountains the descendants of Anak. You know who those were? The giants. Those were the giants. Those were the big people everybody was scared of. He said, I want them. I'll drive them out of the land. He's 85 years old. And instead of asking for Geritol, he's asking to leave it all on the battlefield, fighting giants. He has been eligible for Social Security for 20 years, and he's fighting giants. Rather than asking for a corner room in the nursing home next to a couple of cute little old ladies, he wants to go out and scrap with giants. He wants a challenge. Let me say to those of my fellow gray hairs here, I said fellow. I wasn't accusing you of anything that isn't true of me. If you're looking for the fountain of youth, here's the best way to find it. Find a purpose and stick to that righteous purpose. That's what Caleb was doing. That's what would pay off for him. And so we get to the last 2 chapters of the book, and I'm reminded of General MacArthur delivering a farewell speech before the U.S. Congress on August the 19th, 1951, where he said, "I still remember the refrain of an old but popular barracks ballad which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier in that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him sight to do that duty." Those very same words could have been sung by General Joshua, who now is 110 years old, an old soldier who's ready to fade away to heaven, and he writes his farewells. And so these are the last things he's going to say to these people that he's been with for all these years and led. So he says to them, "Be very careful to follow everything Moses wrote in the book of instruction. Do not deviate from it, turning either to the right or to the left. Make sure you do not associate with the other people remaining in the land. Don't even mention the name of their gods, much less swear by them or serve them or worship them. Rather, cling tightly to the Lord your God as you have done now. He can foresee the day when toleration by the Hebrews of the heathen pagan nations around them will become socialization, and socialization will become assimilation. And they will intermarry the pagans around them and be drawn into their idolatry, and doggone it if that's not exactly what happened, what he warned them against. You see, you can't repent of the very thing you are trying to nurture. That's what he was warning the people of. He was warning the people, temptation is like flypaper. Once you land, it's hard to leave. So you try to avoid the landing. And he told them, as for me and my house, that's what we're going to do. We're going to avoid the landing. So fear the Lord and serve him wholeheartedly. Put away forever the idols your ancestors worshiped when they lived by the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Serve the Lord alone. But if you refuse to serve the Lord, then choose you this day whom you will serve. Would you prefer the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or will it be the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live? As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. May those thrilling words be mine and yours always.